So let's try to watch this.
Genetics. What can it mean? The ability to perfect the physical and mental characteristics of every unborn child.
In the not-too-distant future, our DNA will determine everything about us. A minute drop of blood, saliva, or a single hair determines where you can work, who you should marry, what you're capable of achieving. In a society where success is determined by science, divided by the standards of perfection, one man's only chance,
How do you expect to pull this off? I don't know exactly.
is to hide his own identity
This is the last day that you're going to be you and I'm going to be me.
by borrowing someone else's.
Congratulations. What about the interview? That was it.
That trailer is very 90s, but I think that it's a good way of showing that even in the 90s, this idea was on people's minds enough that it was a part of our sort of futurist dystopia fiction. So I think that's a good example. So what I'd like to show to you today before we get into all the specific names and the movements is that a lot of people in the early 1900s especially saw eugenics as a way that they could eradicate poverty and crime forever. And so eugenicists often were seen as sort of the scientific solution for social problems. And it was taught in 40 of the leading universities in America, including the Ivy League and a lot of the liberal arts colleges. And so the point here is that many eugenicists didn't see themselves as sort of hateful bigots on the fringes of society, or rather they saw themselves as forward-thinking progressives. They were utilizing the power of the state and these new exciting sciences like genetics to improve life in America and quote-unquote clean up society. It wasn't until later with appeals to quote-unquote Nordic superiority and other racial and class discrimination in the US, and then later the Holocaust in Europe, that people begin to understand how dangerous and anti-scientific these ideas are. So in a way it kind of became co-opted by these nationalist, imperialist, and racial essentialist motives. But as scientists like Morgan and Muller, two geneticists we'll look at later, show, many in the movement saw it as a vehicle for the betterment of all mankind, and they didn't have in mind oppression or discrimination. And so I think the lesson stands today is that we're often so eager for progress that we don't see the ways that we can step over human rights, or the ways that we can sort of be blind to the consequences of our actions. This might wind up being the case even in our lifetime with genome editing in people. They can start with benign manipulations like eye color or removing a gene that causes a food allergy, but can very quickly lead to something much more sinister. So yeah, I think we should condemn these eugenicists, but we should also be susceptible. We should be aware that we're susceptible to a lot of the same thinking. Maybe not so much in the bigotry, but in the belief of the perfectibility of humans. And this is going to be a thing that future bioethicists have to deal with. So Charles Davenport, he's kind of the main character of this presentation because he's the leader of the American eugenics movement. He's born in Connecticut in 1866. And he receives his BA in zoology and then a PhD in biology from Harvard. He then becomes a Harvard professor of zoology. Then in 1902, he meets with Galton. That's the British scientist who coined the term genetics. And in this meeting with Galton in England, Davenport is extremely inspired. And Galton and Davenport discuss the possibility of improving the human genetics, and Davenport thinks to apply Mendelian inheritance ratios to people to get desired outcomes. And so this is really kind of a breakthrough for him. He goes back to America and he opens a research station at Cold Spring Harbor, which is in Long Island, not too far from here. And there Davenport begins with cats and chickens, studying the emergence of certain traits. And so in this sense, he is a pioneer in genetics and selective breeding, like Gregor Mendel, he's pushing towards an understanding of this thing called genes that can be quantified and that can predict certain genotypes and phenotypes, although he doesn't have obviously the genetic understanding of it yet. Then in 1910, he starts the Eugenics Records Office at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory with the help of Mary Harriman. She's pictured in the bottom left. And I included this tidbit because I think it shows how entrenched in a lot of our public universities this thinking is. That Mary's family is the family behind the Harriman Institute, which still exists today at Columbia, and it's the main center for Russian studies. And so a lot of these powerful families, like the Carnegies, like the Rockefellers, were investing large sums of money into this research. And then in 1911, Davenport publishes Heredity in Relation to Eugenics, and this kind of becomes the urtext of the American eugenics movement. And it kind of espouses his main philosophy, which is that you can because human traits are genetically inherited, one could in theory, selectively breed people for better traits to improve the human race. And then all the way up into the 20s, Davenport was actually teaching guest courses at Columbia on mental hygiene, which was often rife with his eugenicist thinking. So he opens up shop at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, like I said, in Long Island. Pictured in the bottom right is the Eugenics Record Office, and this is kind of his base of operation. This is where he starts soliciting records, heredity records, including eye color, weight, temperature, mood, intelligence, from a lot of America's public institutions, like, for example, New Jersey's Vineland Training School for the Feeble-Minded. And so when he's asking for these records, he's measuring things like insanity, blindness, epilepsy, neuroticism, paranoia, pauperism, alcoholism, criminality, and feeble-mindedness. And so I'm sure that many of you can already tell these are often subjective and moral categories, what Lynn tells me are called broad constructs in the sciences. And so these are things you can't necessarily isolate to a genome. And so already the eugenics movement is kind of veering into an anti-scientific direction. But he's asking for a lot of these records, and because these traits are being judged from a subjective standard, unfit often includes immigrants, ethnic minorities like Jews, the mentally and physically disabled, the poor, and the morally, quote-unquote, morally delinquent. And so it's already kind of becoming very subjective. So at the ERO, Davenport and his colleagues searched the family trees of patients at these public institutions, and using anecdotal evidence and hearsay from people, he finds a link between quote-unquote defective ancestry and those with undesirable traits in the present. And so as good scientists in the room, I'm sure you can spot the methodological issues already, even morality aside, just from a science standpoint. So then we have some early critics. And to Thomas Hunt Morgan's credit, he is one of the first geneticists to really sort of quietly distance himself from the movement. So in 1913, Morgan runs the Fly Room, which is on the 6th floor of Schermerhorn Hall on Columbia's undergraduate campus. I included that because I took a class in Schermerhorn, so I think that that's a cool detail. And he shows that the genes live in chromosomes and often travel in packs. He's studying fruit flies. He chose fruit flies because they reproduce in just 10 days, and so he can study mutations across multiple generations in a much smaller window of time than other animals. And he discovers that the mechanism of heredity in flies is much more complex than in Mendel's peas. And this makes him suspicious of the certainty of Davenport's study of things like criminality as a gene that can be isolated. And he believes that eugenicists aren't the right answer for informing laws. So he's really opposing it, not so much from a moral standpoint, but from a scientific genetics background. And this, like I said, throws a wrench in Davenport's theory. He writes in a letter to one of his colleagues, "If the eugenicists want to do this sort of thing, well and good, but I think it is just as well for some of us to set a better standard and not appear as participators in the show." And so he quietly backs away from it. But an emphasis on quietly, like Lynn mentioned earlier, a lot of these geneticists, for fear of ostracization in the academia circles, they quietly backed away instead of writing public decries of this movement. So Morgan steps down from the Eugenics Records Office board and sort of is written out of the history. Then you kind of have these two sides forming in America. This is still in the early 1900s. The proponents of the eugenics movement include people like the reformers of the progressive era. So the progressive era is a period of American history from the 1890s to about the 1920s, which were these broad sweeping social reforms. And they included people under that heading there who saw the eugenics movement as a vehicle for their own movement. So hygienists who were against prostitution, who feared the rise of syphilis, saw eugenics as a vehicle to speak their mind. Prohibitionists and temperance movement people who were against alcoholism saw an ally in eugenics and sought to create these social coalitions. But a lot of these movements are appealing to a sort of white Protestant middle class morality that obviously, as I showed earlier, was discriminating against other people. And then in the sciences, the eugenicists are using genetics, physiognomy, which is more of a pseudoscience, evolutionary biology, psychology, paleontology, zoology, embryology. So they're using all the tools that they have at the time to argue these things. And then on the other side, you have the opponents of eugenics, who still in the early 1900s is kind of a smaller group, but over time this group grows and gains more favor. And most of these are geneticists and anthropologists. And I highlighted those because these wind up being sort of the two prongs of the sciences that fight back against eugenics. And also biology. And then through social institutions, you do have the Roman Catholic Church and a lot of Christian institutions, because they don't like this rhetoric of separating the human weeds from the human flowers, because their Judeo-Christian values tell them that all life is equal and that you can't, split between humans like that. And I included these two comics or books because I think this comic on the left shows just how far physiognomy reached the public consciousness. So you have this comic of a genuine husband with a certain skull shape and facial features, and then an unreliable husband. And I think that this was a very commonplace idea that you could actually judge someone's morality or the way that they were going to behave just from their facial features. And it was so embedded into our culture. It wasn't just something that scientists believe. And then this book on the right I included, Liberal Reformers. Thomas C. Leonard writes a great history here of how the exclusionary practices of eugenics and race science kind of taint the intellectual legacy of the progressive movement, and that people who saw themselves as pushing for social progress wound up being inextricably linked to this very evil history. So last year I had the benefit to interview Dr. Jan Witkowski. He's a professor in the School of Biological Sciences, which is the graduate school program at Cold Spring Harbor, the exact laboratory where Davenport once set up shop. And yeah, he was a teacher there, and he studied zoology and biochemistry. He had his degrees in both of those. And he told me this fascinating story of how many people at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory hadn't fully contended with this sort of strange history. And when he was working there, he started looking into it himself and kind of going down these rabbit holes. So he was a great resource to talk to on this, because he had a lot of great research, especially in his book Davenport's Dream, which is a 21st century reflections on heredity and eugenics. But a quote that really stuck out to me from my talk with him, which is, by the 1930s, eugenics had lost significance and became a sort of pseudoscientific topic, but it was still a powerful social and political movement. And as we'll see later, actually the biggest impact eugenics has is in the 30s, even though paradoxically that's when it's at its most unpopular. Then in the 20s, there were two big issues: anti-immigration and sterilization. Another quote that I think is really powerful from Jan is that I think it's worth pointing out or emphasizing that even that eugenics was a very mainstream movement at the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th century. It was both, I don't like the terms, a left-wing and right-wing movement. And so the idea that eugenicists were monsters and were way out there certainly isn't true. And then he goes on to say, it was a group of people who felt that there was an underclass that was causing societal troubles and costing society a lot of money. So these are kind of the four main perpetrators of the American eugenics movement. So I want you all to remember these four names if you come away from this presentation with just that: Davenport, Grant, Osborne, and Laughlin. Davenport, like I mentioned, leader of the movement and the founder of the Eugenics Records Office, which becomes sort of the main database of the eugenics information. And then Madison Grant, who wrote this book called The Passing of the Great Race in 1916, and as we'll look at later, he's one of the first to really racialize eugenics and make it less about the fittest individual, but more about the fittest ethnicity or the fittest race. And so he brings in a totally different sociological construct. Then Henry Fairfield Osborn, who was a vertebrate paleontologist. He was also president of the American Museum of Natural History, and he was one of the co-founders of the American Eugenics Society. And he taught a course at Columbia on the superiority of the white race. And he writes, "In America, the original pioneer stock is dying out. The foreign element is in ascendancy. Purity of race is today found in but one nation, the Scandinavian." And so these, like I said, these mainstream figures on the boards of museums, on the boards of universities were writing about this. Then there's Laughlin, who influenced Congress in immigration and sterilization laws. And we'll get to him next. So Laughlin, in many ways, can kind of be seen as the arch villain of the eugenics movement, because he has the biggest influence on legislation out of any of them. And he was brought in as a eugenics expert in Congress to testify, to change legislation. So Laughlin focuses on sterilization, and he argues that 15 million people in America have to be operated on, have to undergo the knife to fix our social ills. And he largely got his way, because in the 20th century, over 60,000 people were forcibly sterilized across 32 states. And this was still happening up into the 70s, which is just shocking to a lot of people. And he wrote this book in 1922 called Eugenical Sterilization in the United States. And this serves as sort of the blueprint for sterilization laws going forward. So much so that even under Hitler's regime in the 30s in Germany, they looked to the standards set by eugenical sterilization as a sort of a blueprint for how they want to map out these legislations. And Laughlin also influences the U.S. Supreme Court case, Buck versus Bell, in 1927, which is sort of a landmark case, and also a sort of landmark tragedy, because Carrie Buck, the woman who was sterilized here, she's pictured bottom left with her mother, both of which are deemed, carrying defective ancestry, quote unquote. It's just a very sad case of a woman who doesn't have a lot of power. Her defense attorneys are selected by the very eugenicists who are trying to sterilize her. So everything is stacked against her. She's poor. She doesn't have any means to understand what's happening to her, and yet she asked not to be sterilized. And yet the Supreme Court decision decides that she will be the first person in Virginia to be forcibly sterilized. And this sort of sets the legal standard for the rest of the 20th century, which led to the other 70 or 60 so thousand people who were forcibly sterilized. So, in addition to sterilization, Laughlin was also big on immigration. And there was this rhetoric of, we can't just deal with the domestic problem, we have to shut off the valve of foreigners who are increasing this quote-unquote problem. So, Laughlin influences the passing of the Emergency Quota Act of 1921. And this was supposed to just last 1 or 2 years, but it actually extends all the way through the 50s, because it's extended in the Immigration Act of 1924, also known as the Johnson-Reed Act. And this restricts immigration to America by 97%. And so some people have pointed to this as the biggest demographic change in American history. It remained in effect until 1952, and this cartoon in the bottom left showing Uncle Sam only allowing 3% in. This is in reaction to these larger waves of Southern and Eastern European immigrants. And as this chart shows in the bottom right, the majority of immigrants coming into America in the late 1800s were from Northern and Western Europe, which was okay by people like Laughlin and Grant standards. But then at the start of the 1900s, you have the shift towards Southern and Eastern Europe. This causes alarm, and his legislation curbs that back to a Western and Northern European majority. Here's President Coolidge signing the Johnson-Reed Act into law in 1924. And so this just kind of shows how high up these eugenicists got. They were at the highest office of the United States. And there's also literacy tests, and he banned mostly Eastern and Southern European immigrants, but also just all Asian immigrants, with the exception of Japan and the Philippines, were barred entry to America for a 30-year period. And this is also the product of Laughlin and Grant's work. So next I'd like to talk about some more of the critics, because they were, while at the time a minority, they were a vocal minority, and they eventually sort of bested the eugenicists. So on the left we have Franz Boas, and he's kind of seen as the father of the American anthropology movement. He's also a cultural relativist, and we'll get into that later. But his student on the right, Ruth Benedict, they're kind of the two powerful cultural anthropologists of the period fighting this rhetoric. In 1935, Boas writes that there's a growing American fascist movement, and he wants to denounce this and denounce eugenics' connection to it. He also opposed eugenicists like Madison Grant, who wrote The Passing of the Great Race, so much so that Grant and him actually had a fight where Grant tried to get him fired from Columbia because they were sort of aggressive correspondence. All of these people passed through Columbia in some way or another, and so I think that's an interesting personal connection. But this cultural relativist idea that Ruth Benedict lays out in her book Patterns of Culture in 1934 is really the idea that every society comes up with different answers to its challenges. And so there's no reason to think that what we come up with in the Western world in this one place in time is either universal or universally good for all societies. And so it sort of rejects a Western-centric or Eurocentric view of culture. And this book, 1934, Patterns of Culture, I recommend it to anyone. It's a really fascinating look at Ruth Benedict's field work with the indigenous cultures of New Guinea, British Columbia, and New Mexico, where she lives amongst them and tries to understand their culture from their own cultural logic, not from a sort of Western hierarchy. Then on the right you have geneticists, who are also sort of staunch defenders of the natural sciences from eugenics. And they really, first with Thomas Hunt Morgan, as we talked about in the Fly Room, sort of undermining Davenport's theory, and then later with Herman Muller, another geneticist who was one of Morgan's students. He criticizes eugenics for punishing people for their poverty. And so the anthropologists and the geneticists are sort of the last holdout. So more on Herman Muller. Like I said, he believed that eugenics in its current form ignored the socioeconomic roots of crime. And so he's not necessarily against eugenics in the abstract. He still thinks that it can be used as a tool to perfect humans, but he thinks in its current application, it's ignoring socioeconomic forces. And in 1932, there's a big eugenics congress held at New York, and Muller shows up and gives this basically attack on eugenicist thinking. He says, "There's no scientific basis for the conclusion that the socially lower classes have genetically inferior intellectual equipment. Certain slum districts of our cities are veritable factories for the production of criminality among those who happen to be born in them. Under these circumstances, it is society, not the individual, which is the real criminal and which stands to be judged." And so he here kind of is the first formulation of a moral language to combat eugenics on the grounds of a class structure. And yet, this is also a good period for Madison Grant, one of the eugenicists, and this is when he gains a lot of traction as well. So there is this tension. Grant is a zoologist and anthropologist, and he's actually interested in conservation and endangered species. He's one of the people who saves the redwoods in California from extinction. But Grant traces his ancestry back to America's Puritan founders, and he's sort of alarmed by this new wave of Eastern European immigrants, and he sort of says that the old stock of Americans are dying out. And Jan Wachowski, the doctor from Cold Spring Harbor that I interviewed, says anthropology was still at a time when expeditions went out into the jungle to meet primitive people, measure skull sizes, and categorize people along a racial hierarchy. And Grant is very much raised in this tradition, this sort of thinking of measuring skulls and measuring it against the metric of Western civilization. And then he writes in 1916, The Passing of the Great Race. This is kind of the full racialization of eugenics. The book posits a genetic invasion that risks blonde-haired and blue-eyed Nordic superiors with the genes of lesser peoples from the Alpine and Mediterranean regions. And Grant racializes eugenics and makes it not about the fittest individual, but about the fittest ethnicity. And this book is read on the floor of Congress to help pass the Emergency Quota Act of 1921, which, like I mentioned earlier, permanently alters our immigration demographic. Hitler is in prison in the early 1900s for organizing a coup, an unsuccessful coup, against the German government. And as he's in prison, he reads the Passing of the Great Race, Madison Grant's book, and he is so inspired by it that he calls it my Bible. And he says later in Mein Kampf that Madison Grant is offering an example for the Germans to emulate. And then at Columbia, you have the popularity of eugenics as well, even among students. So in 1928, Harold S. Neuberger, night editor for the Columbia Spectator and a Columbia student, he argues that students are demanding eugenics as education for part of the core curriculum, and it just narrowly isn't included in the core curriculum, instead being replaced by contemporary civilization, but it very well could have. And then in the 1920s, Columbia limits Jewish and foreign students with homogeneity tests. And so at the same time that all this is happening, the four big names that we've been discussing of the eugenicist movement are passing through Columbia. Osborne and Davenport are teaching, and Grant gets his law degree from it. And then there's even some eugenicists that people might not expect. People who, in the history books, we see as liberators, and yet they still are very much connected to this legacy. So first you have Margaret Sanger, obviously founder of the American Birth Control League, and she advocated for eugenics. She was interested in quote-unquote race betterment, and she wanted to control the quality of America's population with immigration laws. Even W.E.B. Du Bois, founder of the NAACP, one of the founders, and he's the author of two big texts in sociology, The Talented Tenth and The Souls of Black Folk. He likes eugenics, and he sees it as a vehicle to build a sort of strong black elite. He says we can take the smartest, the most healthy, the most physically fit black Americans, and we can have them have children that lead black people to upend their second-class citizenship in America. And so he sort of paradoxically sees eugenics as a tool for emancipation, not as oppression. And then finally there's Virginia Woolf, the famous modernist 20th century author, and one of the first people to really use stream of consciousness as a narrative device in literature. But she writes in 1915, she's passing a group of institutionalized people with mental disabilities, and she writes, "Everyone in that long line was a miserable, ineffective, shuffling, idiotic creature with no forehead, no chin, and an imbecile grin. They should certainly be killed." And so this was popular thinking even among modernist writers and intellectuals. Like on the left-hand side, you have Virginia Woolf, T.S. Eliot, W.B. Yeats, George Bernard Shaw, D.H. Lawrence, H.G. Wells, Aldous Huxley. So these are, still part of the canon that we all read. And I just thought that was interesting. And in this book, Modernism and Eugenics by Donald J. Childs, Childs notes that half the membership of the Eugenics Education Society was women, and that certain feminists found in the eugenics movement a legitimate public platform for engagement in social activism that they would have otherwise been denied. So this is one of the few areas at that time where a woman could have a voice in public in a real meaningful way for social activism. So two things really are the final nails in the coffin of the eugenics rhetoric, and that is the Great Depression and the Holocaust. The Great Depression totally upends the eugenics rhetoric that poverty is biological. And it's obvious to anyone in the Great Depression that you have lawyers and doctors lining up on the bread lines, that obviously poverty can happen to anyone, and poverty is a socioeconomic construct. It's not something that's coded into our DNA. And this kind of becomes a more acceptable idea across society. And then, of course, you have the Holocaust. And we understand that after this, that race science has these genocidal consequences. So you have, American families that maybe once would have talked about eugenics around the dinner table and seen it as a totally normal thing. They're seeing these headlines come back from Poland and Germany after World War II of these just massive death camps, and they're realizing how evil this science really can be, and they start to distance themselves from it. So after the 30s, Davenport retires, and the Eugenics Records Office closes in 1939. And here eugenics kind of shrinks from the mainstream and goes to more of the fringes of society. And yet, eugenics still kind of persists today in various forms. So I'd like, in this part of the presentation, to go around the world and see different countries where it's still practiced. So today, in China, it's currently launching an ethnic genocide against the Uyghurs. And this is through a campaign of sterilization by injection, forced IUD implementation, and forced abortions. And there were over 330,000 IUDs forcibly installed in 2018. Also, this chart right here shows how sterilizations are also fixated upon this one region where a lot of the Uyghurs tend to live. So it shows that it's not a mistake. There is a sort of targeted campaign to increase sterilizations there. But yeah, this headline from AP News has a lot of good facts on and charting of this troubling, growing concern. But also, there's a trend where Uyghur women are being forced to marry Han Chinese men. Han Chinese being the dominant ethnicity within China and the dominant ethnicity on the earth, being 18% of the global population, and Uyghurs being an ethnic minority largely of the Muslim faith. Then in Brazil, there's also problems. The Kamayura and other indigenous Brazilian peoples still engage in infanticide to this day. So you have this headline on the right to kill. Should Brazil keep its Amazon tribes from taking the lives of their children? And this is sort of an issue of sovereignty, because while the official Brazilian government decries this, they also don't know if they can interfere with the customs that might seem inhumane to the outside world, but to the indigenous peoples, they developed them thousands of years ago often, and it was to ensure their survival in an unforgiving environment like the Amazon rainforest. So there is a bit of an argument of who can decide these things, and can the Brazilian government use eminent domain, so to speak, to step in and tell these indigenous peoples how to behave. That would be like if the American government, went into a Native American reservation and controlled how they, conduct themselves. And these Kamayura people selectively kill children, including the disabled, the children of single mothers, and twins, who they see as bad omens. Then in Europe, you have, in Norway, Anders Breivik. He's a Norwegian domestic terrorist. He committed the 2011 Norway attacks, which killed 77 people with a van bomb and a mass shooting. And this obviously made global headlines. It was a big story, and he's now in prison. But Breivik actually cites Madison Grant, the eugenicist from Columbia, as he cites his racial theory in his manifesto, and cites this as a big inspiration for his thinking. This sort of rhetoric of the pure Nordic ideal of neo-Nazism, which Lynn kind of showed earlier is mostly bogus when you consider the difference between genetic ancestry and social constructs of race, but yet this thinking prevails. And I included this because I think that it shows that a lot of these ideas don't just exist, in history books, but they're still active today out in the world, causing violence and all sorts of troubling trends. Then we'll get into neogenetics and genome editing. And so this is technology that's being developed every day and will honestly change very drastically in our lifetime. But just so far, there is pre-implementation genetic testing, often referred to as PGT. And this is a screening that can be performed on embryos created via in vitro fertilization that can genetically analyze the embryos prior to transfer. And then with the advent of CRISPR technologies, currently it's illegal to use germline cell and embryo editing, but when this changes, and it might, we'll be able to alter human genomes and then have those changes passed down to future generations. So obviously the bioethicists are watching this trend with anxiety. Where do you draw the line of desirable traits versus undesirable traits? I think we could all agree that we'd like to decrease the chance of disease in our children, or maybe even make them healthier or smarter. But how do we prevent this from causing genetic disparities across class lines when you realize that a lot of these technologies in the beginning will be expensive and can only be afforded by certain classes. And also, how do we decide what is an undesirable trait, and how do we sort of deal with that as a moral problem? Not to mention a scientific problem. As we just learned earlier in Lynn's lecture, a lot of these genes are tied and have multiple effects if you try to isolate one. You can't simply take one out of a drawer and put it in another. It's more complicated than that. And then with companies like 23andMe and Ancestry.com, who have become much more popular in recent years, the FDA recently cracked down on 23andMe for inaccurate claims in health-related research, because they argued that if you send them your saliva sample, they can tell you if you're predisposed to certain diseases. And the FDA said, you do not have enough data to claim that yet, and we're going to shut you down. So this is still kind of something that people are debating right now and is affecting companies in America. Then the National Library of Medicine recently released a headline, The Future of Neogenetics. Now that many people approve the elimination of certain genetically defective fetuses is closer to screening all fetuses for all known mutations. And this is another sort of worrying trend and another issue of where to draw the line. And so I think in closing, just to sort of sum up some of the arguments, what can future geneticists do to defeat the eugenic thinking of people like Grant, Osborne, Laughlin, Davenport? And I think Boas, Benedict, Morgan, and Muller show good pathways for arguing against this movement, not just from a moral standpoint, but also from a scientific standpoint, with Boas and Benedict favoring a cultural anthropology, while Grant is favoring a physical anthropology. And then with geneticists, Morgan and Muller really showing the gaps in their thinking and the sort of hubris of these early eugenicists to think that they can play God and that they can have control over human genetics in an informed way enough that they can influence legislation that affects hundreds of thousands of people across America and indeed immigration from other countries. And yeah, just a sort of chilling story that stuck with me from all of this research was that in the Nuremberg trials, which are, of course, the trials that the UN set up to prosecute the Nazis after World War II, one of the defense attorneys of one of the Nazis, who's on trial for eugenic sterilization, his lawyer argues, how are you prosecuting my defendant for a practice of eugenic sterilization when the very body that's prosecuting him, the UN and the United States, is the one who first put these laws on the books and who first kind of widely popularized this practice. And so there is a way that we kind of have to look into the reflection, and we can't just point fingers at the bigots of the past. We have to look at the way that affected our thinking and to prevent it in the future. And so I think for any future geneticists in the room here, these will definitely be concerns that you'll keep with you going forward. Thank you.